Thank you, guys. What a great song. Great song. Thank you for leading us in worship this morning. Thank you for joining with us in worship today at First Baptist. I've begun a series on Sunday evenings about the life of Joseph. Now, we're going to take an aside from that for a couple of weeks, and I'm actually going to look at Joseph this morning. But this evening, at our 6 o'clock worship time, we have two special guests with us. David and Gara Welk are the granddaughter and her husband of Lloyd and Thelma Waters, and they're missionaries in Japan, and they're going to be sharing with us this evening. So, but here's what I want you to do, a couple of things. Lloyd's taken Thelma. Many of you know she's been battling cancer for an extended period of time, and they're going to the hospital today up at BSA to get checked out with some breathing issues she's having. So number one, be in prayer for them. Pray specifically for Thelma, and that the doctors would be able to discover what's going on there and resolve whatever immediate issue that might be. And then also, because they may or may not be able to be here tonight, you need to be here in their place to hear them. And I know that's they'll be a little disappointed if they can't make it this evening. But I hope that the others of you will come and hear from David and Gara and hear how two people, and this is the most amazing thing to me. And David, I don't even know if this is true of you, but Gara is an Oklahoma Sooner. And the fact that God uses an Oklahoma Sooner, Paul, this is for you, Richard. The fact that God uses people like that on the mission field is amazing to me. So come this evening and hear that. If you are new to our church or you were not here last week, the Sunday morning series we're in is called Hooked on a Feeling. And you see these emojis up there. You know, life is about an emoji now. And you've heard me say before, some people live their life like an emoji. In the old days, we would say they live with their feelings on their sleeves. But now you say, well, they live as an emoji, and just pick one. Whatever emotion you want to express for the day. And the problem with that is, well, let me say this first. Emotions are God-given, and that's not a bad thing. Even for a person like me who typically is not a real emotional person, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But some of you people are way overly emotional. No, that's kind of how God created some of you compared to others of us. But there's a biblical response to the emotions and the feelings He gave us. And then there is an unbiblical or fleshly response. There's a way that we can use the way God designed us that's honorable to Him. But then there's a way that we can give in to sin and let those emotions begin to control us. And let those emotions, in fact, dictate the choices we make and the way we live out our lives. And that can be a scary thing. It can be a dangerous thing if we're not living out in obedience to Him. So that's what we're looking at this week. Last week we talked about anger, and specifically about rage. That unbridled, unrestrained, uncontrolled response to anger. Anger is a good thing if used in a righteous manner, and there are examples of righteous indignation or righteous anger we find throughout Scripture. But then I think we all have seen or even personally responded to anger at times in ways that's not at all honorable to the Lord. This morning I want to take you to another feeling. And it's the feeling of lust. That giving in to a God-given desire in a way that is not pleasing to Him. There are two very clear examples of the temptations of lust we find in Scripture. One of those is with David and Bathsheba, where David saw Bathsheba bathing on the rooftop, and he was not where he should have been. He should have been out at war, but he gave in to that temptation, committed adultery with her. And then you might be familiar with a story about the murder that takes place and the destruction of a family that takes place as a result of that sin. So we could look at the temptation of lust from the story of David, but I want this morning to look at the temptation of lust with the story of Joseph. And for a very specific reason. Not that the story of David, we can't learn things from it, But I want you to see from the account of Joseph facing lustful temptation, because Joseph was victorious in his response to that. So what I want you to see this morning is that it is possible. It is possible to make a righteous decision when faced with a temptation that could quickly and easily lead you astray. If you'll look with me in Genesis chapter 39 this morning, I want to read the first 12 verses of this account, and then later, maybe this afternoon, not during the sermon, but later this afternoon, you can read the rest of that chapter and see what the result of Joseph's actions brought on his life. But look with me beginning in verse 1 of chapter 39. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Remember, he was sold into slavery by his brothers. Nice brothers. I mean, you thought your brothers were bad. These were bad brothers. Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. And the Lord was with Joseph, and so he became a successful man. He was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Now his master saw that the Lord was with him, and how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and became his personal servant. He made him an overseer of his house, and all that he owned he put in his charge. All that Potiphar owned he put in the charge of Joseph. And it came about that from the time Potiphar made Joseph overseer in his house and over all that he owned, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. Thus the Lord's blessing was upon all that he owned in the house and in the field. So he left everything he owned in Joseph's charge, and with him there he didn't concern himself with anything except the food with which he ate. Now Joseph was a handsome man in form and appearance. And it came about after these events that his master's wife, Potiphar's wife, looked with desire at Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said this to his master's wife, "Behold, with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has put all that he owns in my charge. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God?" And it came about as she spoke to Joseph day after day, that's important, day after day, that he did not listen to her to lie beside her or to be with her. Now it happened one day that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the household were there inside. And she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside. You see what is taking place here. This Hebrew man who had been sold into slavery by his brothers, because he honored the Lord, because the Lord had a righteous and a very clear, purposeful plan for his life, everything that Joseph touched in Potiphar's household was blessed. You know, that's what happens when you live your life in service to the Lord, that God blesses your life. But God didn't only bless Joseph, he blessed Potiphar's household. He blessed the people they came in contact with, not just the things of the house, but the fruit of the field. It said he even blessed the field of Potiphar was taking place. So Potiphar saw this. He recognized that there was something special about this God that Joseph claimed. And so Potiphar put Joseph over all of his household. I don't know that we fully can understand what a significant position that was. Joseph was he's not just like, head butler of the house. He is, at this point, one of the highest ranking military officials in the land. This is not a political appointment. This is not some cush soft office job. Joseph is a strong, mighty man, and Potiphar recognized his abilities and put him over. He gave him authority over his household. Significant role that Potiphar had placed this man, and Potiphar's wife recognizes not only Joseph's success, that might be what caught her attention, but then she also noticed, hey, this is a good-looking guy. It said he was a well-built and handsome man. I'll just jump right past that. But what Joseph experienced from Mrs. Potiphar was something that so many people, and might I say every person, experiences at some point in their life, is the temptation of lust. The temptation to fulfill a God-given desire in an ungodly manner. But Joseph, because of his fear of the Lord, he hightailed it out of there. He got out of Dodge. I watch a lot of Gunsmoke. He got out of Dodge. I know what that means. He got out of there as quick as he possibly could. We'll come to that a little bit later in the message. But what I want you to see this morning are first, the temptation of lust, how that works, the traps of lust, and then give you some principles that we find in this passage to help you triumph over lustful temptation in life. Let's first look at the temptation of lust. God created us, as I mentioned, and you know this, God created us with feelings and emotions, and one of the strongest desires that we've been given is that desire for physical intimacy. It's one of the most strongest, one of the most strong, consuming, compelling, drawing, driving, controlling impulses that God's given us. But I want you to see that lust is a distortion of a God-given desire. Now, there are different types of lust. There's material lust, there's lust for power. But this morning I want to focus specifically on sensual or sexual lust and that God-given desire that's twisted and distorted in a way to be fulfilled that's not in any way honorable to the Lord. From Joseph's perspective, when faced with the temptation to sin, he clearly resisted. Here's what you need to know about the temptation to sin. It is not a sin to be tempted. It is not a sin to be tempted. The way we respond to temptation determines whether or not we are victorious over that temptation or whether we have failed to that. James chapter 1, verses 13 through 15 says, "When tempted, no one should say, 'God is tempting me,' for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when by his own evil desire he is dragged away and enticed. Then, after desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death." The power of lustful temptation must not be ignored because it quickly gives birth to sin. Listen to this description of temptation by Dietrich Bonhoeffer in his little book entitled Temptation. He said this, he said, "In our members there is a slumbering inclination toward desire, which is both sudden and fierce." In our members, in our body, is a slumbering inclination toward desire, which is both sudden and fierce. All at once a secret smoldering fire is kindled. And then he said this, Bonhoeffer says, "Satan does not here fill us with hatred of God, but with forgetfulness of God. The powers of clear discrimination and of decision are taken from us." Just think about that. Can you think of a time when you were tempted and you gave in to sin and then afterwards overcome with conviction as a believer, with guilt, and you thought, "I just don't know what I was thinking. I just wasn't thinking clear." Well, no, you weren't thinking clear. But that's what the enemy does, is he distorts our thinking in relation to temptation at the moment of sin or the moment temptation comes to lead us astray. Remember, the temptation is not the sin, but the response to the temptation is what matters. Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, wasn't he? Yet he was without sin. Say, "Well, I'm not Jesus." Well, I'm not either. But Jesus demonstrated to us the power of righteousness over fleshly desire. So it's important for us to see that this morning and to realize that we have to train our minds to recognize and identify sinful temptation when it comes and to respond and resist that temptation. Here are two good summary statements to understand a biblical response to temptation. First is this: the satisfaction of desire for intimacy within God's design is honorable and yields delight. The satisfaction of a God-given desire within God's design is honorable. God honors the marriage bed and desires that we keep it holy. So therefore, we must honor what God has designed, the way He wants those God-given desires to be fulfilled. And that brings delight not only to the individuals, but it brings delight to the Lord that we act upon His God-given feelings in a way that honors Him. But the flip side of that is the satisfaction of lustful desire outside of God's design is sinful and yields destruction. The satisfaction of a God-given desire that is acted out on in a sinful manner does not honor the Lord, and it brings destruction to your life. And I'll talk in just a little bit more about others who are destructed or who are destroyed when we give in to lustful temptation. Secondly, this morning, consider with me the traps of lust. The traps of lust. There are three warning signs that we find in this passage about when temptation comes. First, lustful temptation often comes during prosperous times. Lustful temptation often comes during prosperous times. Notice that Joseph was well respected. Joseph was doing really, really well. And you might say he was on top of the world. I realize he was a slave, but he had some power. And he had some prosperity as much as that power could give him in that place. And Joseph was doing well. He was well respected. And many times when we are well respected, when life is going well, that we become blinded to the temptation of sin and we become very susceptible to the destruction of the enemy. See, sometimes we think, oh, it's just when the people that go to bad places and do bad things, they're the ones that are going to give in to sin. Not true. Not true. Well, people going to bad places and doing bad things have already given in to sin, so they're already in the process. But you who are walking with the Lord, when you are often most susceptible to sin is when you look at your life and you go, everything's going so well. You know what happens when things are going well? We begin to feel a little self-confident. We think, I got this all together. And then we begin to have a little too high of an estimation of ourselves and think, oh, I'm above that. I would never do that. You fill in the blank. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12 and 13 says, if any man thinks he stands firm, take heed lest he fall. If you think you got it all under control, if you think you are in control, you better watch out, because that is exactly when you can easily get knocked down off that pedestal. Prosperous times are dangerous times. Times that we need to be aware and alert for temptation that comes. Secondly, lustful temptation is persistent in its approach. Verse 10, as I was reading, said, day after day, Mrs. Potiphar, the original desperate housewife, if you will. Mrs. Potiphar, I say that, I never watched, I don't even know that I ever watched a full commercial of that show, Desperate Housewife. We're watching TV this week, watching just a decent show, and this commercial comes up for this show called Temptation Island. Hopefully, none of you people are crazy enough to watch the thing. We're over there, you can't change the channel quick enough during the commercial, because the commercial is filth. Even the commercial itself is just promoting ungodliness. And no child of God has any moment's business whatsoever entertaining any of that trash. Not at all. You know why it's still on TV? Because Christian people put up with it. Christian people watch that stuff. What's that filthy book that came out a couple years ago, 50 Shades of Grey or whatever it was? And then a movie that came out. research shows that Christian women bought and read that trash as much as lost women. And then we wonder why the world looks like it does. It's filth. Mrs. Potiphar was persistent. Day after day after day, she came back to Joseph with this enticement, this seductive invitation, trying to draw him into herself. Temptation, lustful temptation, is persistent. It is relentless. And that's the way the enemy works in our life. Here's how it works. It is very, very seldom that you will give in to temptation the first time you're tempted. It is very, very seldom that you give in to temptation the first time that thought comes into your mind. But the enemy, Bible says, is like a roaring lion seeking one whom he may devour. He lies in wait. He lies in wait, watching to destroy, and catching us at a moment of a lack of alertness, a moment where we're asleep spiritually. Sinful temptation is like waves crashing the seashore. I didn't really understand this till we lived so many years down the Gulf Coast, and they would talk about beach erosion. Like, what is beach erosion? I didn't know anything about that. And then certainly hurricanes would come in, then you'd have just immediate impact, and you would notice that. But what happens is a wave comes in and it crashes on the seashore, or it goes up against the seawall, and you don't think there's anything of it. But every time it hits, it washes a little sand away with it. Every time it hits, it begins to erode and diminish the strength of that barrier. That's what lustful temptation does. It is relentless. It is over and over and over, day after day after day. Joseph is tempted by Potiphar's wife. That's the way the enemy works in our lives. So don't ever pat yourself on the back and say, "Oh, I resisted that temptation. I'm good." Because then, just as you're feeling all self-satisfied the next day, you will get hit at a weak moment and it will destroy the barrier that you put up. Lustful temptation is persistent in its approach. Lustful temptation comes at prosperous times in our life. And also we see that lustful temptation is most dangerous when we're in times of privacy. Notice that she comes to Joseph one day specifically when all the other men of the house were gone. They were out doing their jobs, they were out working, whatever it may be. And in that moment of privacy, we are so very susceptible to giving in to the enemy. Be careful when you're alone. Be careful when you're alone with someone of the opposite sex who's not your spouse. Be careful when you're alone on a computer. Listen, I love these devices we have. I absolutely love them, but they are so dangerous to Christian people that think, "Oh, I would never." Set boundaries in your life and preclude those situations that open you up to temptation. One good rule for families, and we didn't have devices really when our kids were little that I don't remember, but one good rule that I've heard some families practice is that they don't allow devices to be in private rooms. Like if their kids have a computer or device or their phones, whatever, they have to be in the common gathering rooms. And then at night they take those phones or those iPads or whatever and they put them on a charger in the common place where the kids or the husband or the wife and alone in a room by themselves don't have that tablet, that temptation right there in their face. And let me just say this, kids, parents, you ought to go home and institute some of those rules. And when the kids get mad at you for it, say, well, the preacher said to do it. They can be mad at me all they want to. I don't care. But here's what's important, is that this is not for our restriction, it's for our protection. It's just exercising wisdom as believers, because the enemy is so clever and perceptive about knowing how to destroy a life that God wants to bless. Well, the beautiful thing about this story is Mrs. Potiphar didn't win the day. Say, well, oh, Joseph ended up getting caught and thrown in prison. No. What matters is that Joseph was triumphant over the lustful temptation that was thrown in his face. So what do we find here in this passage? Then I'll add one other from David's story. What are some measures that help us to be triumphant over lust? First, your reputation is worthy of protection. It must be valued and safeguarded. Your reputation is worthy of protection. We saw in verse 8 where Joseph said, my master trusts me. He's given me control over all this stuff. He trusts me. Joseph recognized that he had a value, he had a special reputation, and he knew that it was worthy of value. Here's what that means. Remember whose you are. Remember whose you are. There are three ways this applies. One way in my personal life with our marriage, I have always thought about that. And in certain situations, I know that it's important for a pastor, for any married man, but especially in my role, that I've put up some safeguards to guard my reputation. One of those is in my outer office where I meet with people. There are pictures of my wife and my kids. And when I'm in a pastoral counseling situation, the door might be closed. There's a window on the door, and there's always somebody in the outer office there when I'm in a situation like that. But I have pictures of my family that reminds me of my reputation, reminds me what is and who is most significant, most important in my life. And almost every time I am very intentional about mentioning my wife in the course of an initial conversation. You know what that does? It just says, I'm sharing with you about what's going on, but listen, I want the world to know that the most important person to me in this world is that lady right there. On the second row in the... That's not to mean my kids aren't significant, but the best gift I can give my kids is faithfulness to their mother. So guard your reputation. Parents, guard the reputations of your kids. If your kids grow up hearing from you how special they are, then they're not going to be so quick to give in from the lie of some sorry dude that comes along and tries to give them some line of garbage. If they know how special they are in your eyes and the eyes of God, it's a tremendous barrier in safeguarding their reputation. Another aspect of protecting your reputation is knowing who built it. Joseph knew that his reputation, his successes came from the Lord. His successes, his reputation came from the Lord, and so he guarded that. So your reputation is worthy of protection. Secondly, recognize the problem of sin. He said, how can I do this thing and sin against God? Sin brings pleasure for a season. Don't think that it doesn't. I think we all know that giving into sin, it brings pleasure for a season, but only for a short little while. And know this, that all that glitters is not gold. If you haven't figured that out in life, all that glitters is not gold. The grass you think it's greener on the other side, but it is not. It's like a mirage. You think that grass is greener over there, and then you cross over into a sinful lifestyle, and you realize it is dead and brown and crunchy, like winter grass in the Texas Panhandle. It's dry. There's no nourishment there. There's no life there. All it leads to in your life is just dormancy. Recognize the problem of sin. Sin always brings about guilt and consequences of broken communion with God, broken relationships, broken marriages, the loss of children, the loss of self-worth, sexually transmitted diseases, and the list goes on and on and on and on. Another way to control that God-given desire, but to keep it from being used in a dishonorable way, is to remove yourself from close proximity to temptation. Joseph hightailed it out of there. When you are faced in a moment of lustful temptation, it is not time to sit there with your girlfriend and say, well, let's pray about how we should respond right now. Get out of there. That's not the time. Have those standards, have biblical guidelines rooted in your heart and determined before you get to that moment. No, at that moment when the lustful temptation comes up, get out. Flee from it. And that's what Joseph did. And, we just get this picture that he just busts out of there, and his cloak he leaves behind because she grabs a hold of it. He says no, and she couldn't take it anymore. She grabs his cloak, and he just runs out of it and takes off. Well, then, the end of the story, she shows it to her husband. He gets thrown in jail. But you know what? Even God honored that because Joseph responded to temptation in an honorable way. 1 Corinthians, just two references to write down. 1 Corinthians 6:18 says, flee from sexual immorality. 1 Thessalonians 5:22 says, abstain from every form of evil, even the appearance of evil. We have to guard against. Let me add one more warning from the account of David's sin with Bathsheba. Restrict those things at which you peer. Restrict those things at which you are fixated upon. Job 31, chapter 31, verse 1, he says, I've made a covenant with my eyes. I've made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully upon a young maiden or young woman. Listen, get this, understand it. Being tempted is not a sin, but how we respond to that temptation is sin. You may not be able to control the initial glance, but you can always control the persistent gaze. You may not be able to control that initial glance that flashes across your screen or that billboard on the highway or that whatever, but you can always control that persistent gaze, that fixation upon the opportunity, the invitation of temptation. Let me close with this. Temptation is like a telemarketer. Anybody like telemarketers? Temptation is like a telemarketer. It comes as a distraction when you least expect it. It calls again and again. It keeps pushing even after you say no. And it makes what is selling sound great, but there's always a catch. So guard your heart, guard your reputation, and guard the name of Jesus.